we've seen that in order to justify the hypothesis that the effect heuristic explains moral intuitions, we need to show that moral attributes are inaccessible. So let's take a look at an argument designed to do just that. I should start off by reminding you that when we're talking about accessibility, what we mean is this. An attribute such as wrongness is accessible just if a subject can readily form or come to know truths about that attribute. So for example, a paradigm case for property which is inaccessible, at least for most fortunate people, is the risk they face of dying from a particular cancer in a given year. That would be an inaccessible attribute because most people thankfully have no idea what the risk is associated with different cancers. That's of course relevant to how we were thinking about the effect heuristic concerning risk judgments earlier. So here's the argument. The argument's this: no plausible theory will make moral wrongness accessible. Well, what's a plausible theory? I'm glad you asked. What Sinnott-Armstrong and colleagues are going to do is they're going to go through a range of theories, and their idea is, look, any reasonable theory about moral wrongness will result in that attribute being inaccessible. And that's relevant for us because if it's inaccessible, it can't be what people compute that enables them to track moral attributes, and so it can't be what's behind their moral intuitions. And then the effect heuristic arguments can all get started. All right, good. So what could moral wrongness be? What are these plausible theories? First idea, having bad consequences. An argument is morally wrong if it has bad consequences, give or take. Sinnott-Armstrong and colleagues say nobody has the information or capacity required to calculate consequences. And here I think this is a powerful argument. Right? This is a powerful argument. And it suggests that if we think about moral attributes in terms of bad consequences, then they're just going to fall into the same category that risk of dying from particular cancer does for most people. Most people are in the happy position of not having the information required to calculate that risk. So it can't be something that they are computing. The property is inaccessible. What about this as a second candidate though? Maybe moral wrongness is not a matter of actually having bad consequences, but rather what reasonably could be expected to follow from it. Now this is harder because we can't argue here that people don't have the information. What Sinnott-Armstrong and colleagues say is it's also often hard to tell whether a real agent reasonably believes that an act will maximize the good. But you know, if you wrote this in your essay, if you said hard to tell, I would be pushing you on this. I don't find this very convincing, I have to tell you. I don't want you to write hard to tell in your essay. The question is the attribute inaccessible or not? And if we think about the attribute of being expected to have bad consequences, is that inaccessible? Are you here relying on a premise that anything where it's hard to tell whether it obtains is going to be inaccessible? And is that a true premise? If so, tell me. Right? Quite a bit more work's needed here. I also object quite strongly to this often. I don't think that often is doing a lot of work there as well. So what I want to say here is, look, there might be an argument. There might well be an argument. It might be that you can make the argument. But what Sinnott and Armstrong and colleagues have done is something that if you put that in your mini essay and submitted it to me, I would be saying, no, no, no. Let's do better. Let's have an argument. Right? Let's have an argument. A third candidate they consider is corresponding to a universalizable maxim. A universalizable maxim. I guess they have, you know, some famous old philosophers in the background here, maybe Kant or somebody like that. Anyway, and they suggest this would make moral wrongness inaccessible because they say it's hard to tell, ouch, what the maxim of an act is, what it means for an act to be universalizable or not, and whether a given maxim is universalizable. Now here I'm looking ahead slightly. So when we have this hard to tell here, I think this means probably something a little bit different from the previous hard to tell. I think what they mean here is something like this. You and I are not in a position to articulate what the maxim of an act is, right? And we're also not in a position to articulate any of these things. But that, of course, doesn't mean that the attribute itself, which depends on this, is inaccessible. When we look later at the case of syntax, in the next part of this lecture, we'll see exactly a case where it doesn't follow from our being able to not to articulate principles, doesn't follow that we can't have properties whose applicability depends on the principles, and nevertheless those attributes are accessible. So here I think their argument is interesting, but we're going to see an objection to this particular version of their argument. So more work is needed there as well. And they go on, so they consider, I think, 5 candidates in total, and you can take a look at their text and see what they say about these things. My suggestion is that if you're going to rely on this, you're going to have to do slightly better than those researchers have done. So their idea is very simple. We've been looking at the plausible theories, and they think no plausible theory will make moral wrongness accessible. Now, I think this is an interesting strategy, and it may well be that you can make the strategy work, but I don't think in the literature that I've read yet, I've seen a compelling argument based on this strategy. I think for now, I'm not prepared to accept the negative conclusion that moral wrongness is not accessible. I want to be neutral about that. Doesn't mean I'm accepting the converse, that it is accessible. I'm just being neutral about this because I haven't seen yet a good argument that it's not accessible. And I need such an argument in order to accept the hypothesis that the effect heuristic explains moral intuitions in humans. So I'm kind of stuck at this point. Interesting.